7th of December, 1941. The morning sun rose over Pearl Harbor as it always had, indifferent to the armada of Japanese carrier aircraft descending through Hawaiian clouds like angels of destruction. In those first 18 minutes, the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier strike force demonstrated what 6 years of meticulous preparation could achieve: the sinking of 4 American battleships and the crippling of 4 more. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto watched reports flood into his flagship, knowing he had awakened a giant, but hoping the blow would prove decisive enough to negotiate peace before American industry could respond. What neither he nor anyone else in Tokyo truly comprehended was that they hadn't struck a nation. They'd struck a factory. From Washington to Seattle, from Philadelphia to San Francisco, the attack transformed American shipyards overnight from commercial enterprises into engines of total war. The Roosevelt administration immediately authorized construction programs that Japanese military planners would have dismissed as fantasy. When American officials proposed building 100 aircraft carriers of various classes within 4 years, Japanese intelligence analysts labeled the figures propaganda. They were underestimating by half. Japan had spent the 1930s building a carrier force that represented the absolute pinnacle of naval aviation. The Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku formed the most experienced carrier battle group ever assembled, their air crews veterans of the China campaign with combat experience no American pilot could match. These ships embodied years of careful doctrinal development, specialized training, and technological refinement. Each carrier represented a massive investment of resources in a nation where steel was perpetually scarce, and oil had to be imported across vast ocean distances. According to research compiled in Shattered Sword, The Untold Story of the Battle of Midway, by Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully, Japanese naval construction doctrine emphasized quality over quantity, producing fewer but theoretically superior vessels. This philosophy made perfect sense for an island nation with limited industrial capacity, until it didn't. American shipyards in early 1942 bore little resemblance to their Axis counterparts. Henry Kaiser, a construction magnate who'd never built a ship before the war, revolutionized maritime construction by applying assembly line techniques developed in automobile manufacturing. His Richmond shipyard in California could produce a Liberty cargo ship in 45 days, then 40, then 35. Other yards watched, learned, and adapted these methods to warship construction. The traditional approach of laying keels and building vessels from the waterline up gave way to prefabrication. Entire ship sections were constructed inland by workers who'd never seen the ocean, then transported to yards for final assembly. The Essex-class fleet carrier program epitomized this industrial transformation. When the Navy ordered the first ships in 1940, designers created a vessel that balanced capability with mass production feasibility. Unlike Japanese carriers, which featured unique designs requiring specialized construction techniques, Essex-class carriers were deliberately standardized. Every ship used identical plans, identical parts, identical systems. A welder trained on one vessel could transfer to another yard and immediately contribute. This wasn't elegant engineering, it was industrial warfare, and it would prove utterly devastating. 24th of May, 1942, the Battle of the Coral Sea ended with both sides claiming victory, but the strategic calculus revealed an uncomfortable truth for Japan. The carrier Shokaku had been damaged and required 2 months of repairs. Her sister ship Zuikaku had lost so many aircraft and trained pilots that she couldn't participate in upcoming operations, despite remaining physically undamaged. For Japan's already strained pilot training program, replacing experienced aircrew took 6 months minimum. These 2 carriers, representing a third of Japan's elite strike force, would miss the most decisive naval battle in Pacific history. Meanwhile, American yards worked around the clock. The Essex-class carrier Yorktown, named for the vessel sunk at Midway, slid down the ways at Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia on 21st of January 1943, just 8 months after her keel was laid. Traditional naval construction wisdom suggested fleet carriers required 3 to 4 years from start to completion. American yards were now completing them in 18 months, then 16, then 14. Each successive ship incorporated lessons learned from previous vessels, a process of continuous improvement impossible in Japanese yards, where each carrier remained a semi-custom project. The Independence-class light carriers demonstrated even more audacious thinking. Navy planners realized that Cleveland-class light cruiser hulls under construction could be converted to small carriers, sacrificing armor and some capability for speed of production. 9 such conversions were completed between January 1943 and December of that year, more carriers than Japan built during the entire war. These ships carried fewer aircraft than fleet carriers, operated with reduced range, and lacked the armored flight decks of their larger cousins. None of that mattered. They put aircraft to sea, and at this stage of the war, presence mattered more than perfection. Japanese shipyards couldn't replicate this output even if resources had been unlimited. The fundamental constraints of island geography meant Japan possessed fewer major shipyards than America, and those yards couldn't expand significantly. Shortages of steel, aluminum, and trained labor grew worse as the war progressed. American submarines operating in Japanese waters began targeting merchant vessels carrying raw materials from the southern resource area, the conquered territories of Southeast Asia, that were supposed to fuel Japan's war machine. Each cargo ship sunk meant fewer resources for carrier construction, creating a vicious cycle where Japan needed carriers to protect convoys to build carriers. The numbers told a story of industrial asymmetry so vast it defied traditional military analysis. According to documentation from the Naval History and Heritage Command, by mid-1943, American yards had 10 fleet carriers under construction simultaneously, alongside dozens of escort carriers. Japanese yards struggled to replace losses from Midway and subsequent battles. The carrier Taiho, Japan's most advanced carrier incorporating armored flight decks and improved damage control, took 3 years to complete and was sunk by a single submarine torpedo on her maiden combat operation in June 1944, a devastating return on investment. American escort carriers, dismissed by some naval officers as jeep carriers or Kaiser coffins, nonetheless changed the war's calculus. Built on merchant ship hulls using the same mass production techniques Kaiser pioneered, these small carriers couldn't match fleet carriers in capability. What they could do was provide air cover for convoys, support amphibious landings, transport aircraft, and free up fleet carriers for offensive operations. Between 1942 and 1945, American yards completed 50 escort carriers for the U.S. Navy alone, with dozens more built for Britain under Lend-Lease. Japan built 0 escort carriers, a decision reflecting both resource constraints and doctrinal rigidity. 15th of June, 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea opened with Japanese carriers launching everything they had at American Task Force 58. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher commanded a force that would have seemed impossible 3 years earlier. 7 fleet carriers, 8 light carriers, and more than 900 aircraft. The Japanese strike force represented nearly everything left of Imperial Navy carrier aviation. 373 aircraft, from 5 carriers, flown by crews whose training had been shortened from 18 months to 6 months to 3 months as losses mounted and oil for training flights dwindled. What followed became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a name that understated the tragedy for Japan. American fighters equipped with new radar and fighter director systems vectored onto incoming raids with devastating precision. Of the 373 Japanese aircraft launched that morning, only 30 returned to their carriers. American losses totaled 29 aircraft. The battle wasn't close. It was industrial capacity made visible, the quantifiable difference between a nation that could train replacement pilots faster than they died and a nation that could not. The human cost of this disparity haunted both sides, though in different ways. American pilot training programs churned out aviators at a rate that seemed impossible to Japanese planners. Flight schools across the United States expanded continuously, with training curricula that prioritized getting adequate pilots to the fleet quickly, rather than producing small numbers of exceptional aviators. Japanese pilot training, conversely, remained elite and exclusive, even as the empire desperately needed more aviators. The cultural preference for quality over quantity that shaped carrier construction also governed personnel policies, with predictably catastrophic results. American carriers benefited from another invisible advantage: crew rotation. Squadrons deployed for combat tours, then rotated back to train new pilots, passing hard-won tactical knowledge to the next generation. Combat-experienced aviators became instructors, creating a multiplier effect where each veteran's lessons reached dozens of new pilots. Japan's system kept experienced pilots in combat until they died, losing not just the individual, but all their accumulated knowledge. By 1944, Japanese carrier air groups contained inexperienced pilots flying obsolete aircraft against Americans who'd been trained by veterans flying superior machines. The Essex-class carrier Franklin illustrated both American industrial capacity and its human cost. Commissioned in January 1944, she deployed to the Pacific and participated in strikes against the Japanese homeland. On 19th of March, 1945, 2 bombs struck Franklin while her aircraft were being armed for a strike, triggering massive fires and explosions. Traditional naval thinking suggested she was doomed. Fires raged uncontrolled, munitions cooked off, and over 700 of her crew died. The ship survived through heroic damage control, limped to Pearl Harbor, then Brooklyn Navy Yard, and returned to service. A Japanese carrier suffering equivalent damage would have been abandoned or scuttled. Japan couldn't spare the months of yard time required for such extensive repairs. American shipyards maintained this capacity because they'd built redundancy into the system. Multiple yards could service carriers simultaneously. Brooklyn Navy Yard, Puget Sound, Naval Shipyard, Mare Island Naval Shipyard. Each possessed the infrastructure and skilled workforce to handle battle damage repairs while simultaneously constructing new vessels. When Franklin underwent repairs, construction continued unabated on other Essex-class carriers. Japan's limited yard capacity meant battle damage repairs competed directly with new construction for resources and skilled labor. 3rd of October 1944, Admiral William Bull Halsey commanded 3rd Fleet with a carrier force that embodied American strategic thinking: 8 fleet carriers, 8 light carriers, 6 battleships, 17 cruisers, and 63 destroyers. This single task force fielded more carriers than Japan had built in the entire war. The upcoming Battle of Leyte Gulf would see American naval aviation operating with such numerical superiority that tactical mistakes barely mattered. There were simply too many American ships and aircraft for Japanese forces to engage effectively. This concentration of power represented a fundamental shift in naval doctrine. Pre-war theorists had envisioned carrier battles as duels between roughly equal forces, where superior training and tactics would prove decisive. American industrial output transformed carrier warfare into something closer to siege warfare at sea. The systematic application of overwhelming force against progressively weaker opposition. Japanese carriers at Leyte Gulf were reduced to decoys, deliberately exposing themselves to draw American forces away from vulnerable transports. The strategy worked tactically, but failed strategically. Even drawing off the main American carrier force, Japan couldn't exploit the opening because they lacked the resources for a decisive blow. The Battle of Cape Engano on 25th of October epitomized this asymmetry. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded Japan's northern force with 4 carriers: Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda, carrying a total of 116 aircraft. These weren't the elite carrier air groups of 1941. Most experienced pilots were dead, and replacement aviators had minimal training. American carrier aircraft attacked in waves throughout the day, sinking all 4 Japanese carriers. Zuikaku, the last survivor of the Pearl Harbor attack force, went down that afternoon, taking with her the lineage of the most successful carrier force in history. American carrier doctrine by late 1944 emphasized redundancy and mutual support. Task groups operated with multiple carriers, so that damage to one ship didn't cripple the group's combat power. This was wasteful by Japanese standards. Putting multiple carriers in proximity violated Japanese doctrine about dispersing strike power, but it reflected American abundance. Losing one carrier from a 3-carrier task group reduced combat power by 33%. Losing one carrier from a formation of 8 reduced power by 12.5%. The mathematics of attrition favored the nation that could field more ships. Essex-class carriers demonstrated their design philosophy during these operations. The ships were large enough to carry substantial air groups, 90 to 100 aircraft, but not so specialized that they required unique parts or procedures. Damage to one Essex could be repaired using parts from another. Air groups could transfer between ships with minimal adaptation. This interchangeability seemed mundane, but proved strategically crucial. When the carrier Bunker Hill was hit by two kamikazes in May 1945, killing 396 crew members and forcing her withdrawal, the task force simply continued operations. There were other carriers, other air groups, other pilots. The loss hurt, but didn't matter strategically. Japanese carriers by this point represented heritage more than combat power. The Shinano, converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull into the world's largest aircraft carrier, was torpedoed by the submarine USS Archerfish on her maiden voyage in November 1944. She'd been intended to serve as a floating airfield, a supply and support ship for carrier air groups. Her loss demonstrated how far Japanese carrier doctrine had fallen. From offensive strike weapons to logistical platforms, and even those couldn't survive. The Shinano had taken years to build, consumed resources Japan couldn't spare, and contributed nothing to the war effort beyond a footnote in naval history. 1st of January 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy began the year with effectively 0 operational fleet carriers. Unryu, Amagi, and Katsuragi remained in Japanese waters, but lack of fuel, aircraft, and trained pilots rendered them useless. The combined fleet that had terrorized the Pacific 3 years earlier existed primarily as an administrative entity, its combat power reduced to suicide weapons and desperate defensive operations. American carrier forces, conversely, had grown so large that operational commanders struggled with coordination rather than capability. The numbers represented more than industrial output. They quantified the complete collapse of Japan's strategic position. According to U.S. Navy records, by January 1945, American carrier forces in the Pacific included 13 fleet carriers and dozens of light and escort carriers, with more completing sea trials monthly. These ships operated with near impunity in waters Japan once considered secure. Carrier aircraft struck the Japanese homeland itself, attacking airfields, harbors, and industrial facilities. Japanese fighters rose to defend but lacked the fuel for sustained operations, the pilot training for effective intercepts, and the numerical strength to matter against 100-plane American raids. The Essex-class production line demonstrated industrial warfare's ultimate logic: build faster than the enemy can sink. Even accounting for battle damage and operational losses, American carrier strength increased month after month. The carriers Bonhomme Richard, Leyte, Kearsarge, Tarawa, and others joined the fleet throughout 1945, each adding 90 aircraft and 3,000 trained crew to American naval aviation. Japan could sink carriers. Kamikazes proved devastatingly effective against ships designed without armored flight decks, but couldn't sink them faster than America built them. This mathematical reality shaped the war's final months in ways pure military analysis struggled to capture. When the carrier Bunker Hill was knocked out of action in May 1945, she represented several thousand tons of steel, tens of millions of dollars in construction costs, and 396 dead sailors. The loss was genuine tragedy for the families of the dead and injured. Strategically, however, the damage barely registered. Task Force 58 continued operations without pause. Other carriers absorbed Bunker Hill's missions. The industrial base that built Bunker Hill was already constructing her replacements. Japanese strategic planning in early 1945 reflected desperation born from this asymmetry. Operation Tengo, the suicidal surface sortie of the battleship Yamato in April, represented a naval force reduced to throwing away its remaining assets because keeping them achieved nothing. The accompanying carrier doctrine called for land-based aircraft to provide cover. The carriers themselves stayed in port, out of fuel and aircraft. When American carrier planes sank Yamato on 7th of April, they operated from carriers Japan could neither match nor meaningfully attack. The invasion of Okinawa showcased American carrier power at its zenith and its most vulnerable. Hundreds of kamikaze attacks targeted the supporting carrier force, sinking several escort carriers and damaging fleet carriers. The carrier Franklin, already damaged in March, was hit again. These attacks killed thousands of American sailors and validated Japanese tactical innovation in suicide weapons. None of it mattered strategically because American carriers kept coming. For every ship damaged, 2 more arrived. For every pilot killed, 3 replacement pilots deployed. The mathematics of attrition favored the nation, whose industrial output exceeded enemy sinking capacity. 15th of August, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement reached Japanese forces that had fought with fanatical determination despite overwhelming material disadvantage. The Imperial Navy's carrier force that began the war with 6 elite carriers attacking Pearl Harbor ended it with 0 operational carriers, its doctrines proven inadequate, its industrial base destroyed by the very American carrier aviation it had once dominated. The United States Navy, which had begun the war with 7 fleet carriers and scrambled to replace early losses, finished with dozens of carriers of all types, with more still under construction. The war's statistical record revealed industrial disparity that redefined naval warfare. Between December 1941 and August 1945, Japanese yards completed 7 fleet carriers and 5 light carriers. American yards completed 17 fleet carriers, 9 light carriers, and 77 escort carriers for the U.S. Navy alone, with dozens more for Allied navies. This 100-to-1 advantage in carrier construction represented more than manufacturing capacity. It represented fundamentally different approaches to industrial warfare. Japan's pre-war naval strategy rested on assumptions that seemed reasonable in the 1930s. Build a qualitatively superior navy, sink enough American ships in a decisive battle, and negotiate a favorable peace before American industry could respond. These assumptions failed because they underestimated both American industrial capacity and American willingness to accept casualties while building toward overwhelming superiority. The 6 months Yamamoto requested to run wild in the Pacific stretched to 8 months, but the decisive victory never came, and when American production hit full stride in 1943, Japanese strategic options collapsed. The Essex-class carrier program epitomized American advantages. 24 ships were eventually built, with 14 completed before war's end. Each carrier represented refined mass production, standardized designs, interchangeable parts, parallel construction at multiple yards, and continuous incorporation of lessons learned. The ships weren't perfect. Some critics argued they lacked armored flight decks and had marginal stability. But they were good enough, and America built them faster than Japan could sink them. Good enough in quantity defeated perfect in scarcity. Economic analysis after the war revealed the scale of disparity. The United States spent roughly 40% of GDP on the war effort between 1942 and 1945, while maintaining civilian living standards that seemed luxurious compared to wartime deprivation in other combatant nations. Japan mobilized comparably in percentage terms, but from a much smaller economic base. An island nation, dependent on imported resources, couldn't match continental industrial capacity, especially once American submarines severed maritime supply lines. By 1945, Japan faced raw material shortages so severe that carrier construction became theoretically impossible regardless of yard capacity. American carrier dominance in the Pacific's final year demonstrated what unchallenged naval aviation could achieve. Carrier aircraft struck targets across the Japanese home islands with relative impunity. The March 1945 firebombing of Tokyo involved B-29s operating from the Marianas, but carrier aircraft softened defenses and struck supporting targets. The industrial facilities that built Japan's 6 carriers at war's start were destroyed by aircraft operating from American carriers whose existence Japanese planners had dismissed as propaganda fantasy. 28th of July, 1945. The carrier Belleau Wood departed Japanese waters after months of continuous operations, supporting the invasion of Okinawa and strikes against the Japanese homeland. Her crew had been at sea for months, operating under constant threat of kamikaze attack, watching sister ships damaged and sailors killed. The victory these operations secured came at tremendous human cost, even for the winning side. Carriers might be replaced within months, But dead sailors left permanent absences in families and communities across America. The industrial miracle that produced American naval dominance obscured uncomfortable questions about the war's human dimensions. Shipyard workers in Richmond, California, and Newport News, Virginia, built carriers at unprecedented rates. But what did it mean that a nation could construct warships faster than another nation could train pilots to fly from them? The answer involved 24-hour shifts, women entering heavy industry in unprecedented numbers, rationing of consumer goods, and a national focus on production that subordinated virtually everything to winning the war. American abundance made this easier than comparable efforts elsewhere, but it still required sacrifice. Japanese carrier construction, conversely, represented a nation straining beyond its capacity. The Shinano, converted from a battleship hull into the world's largest carrier, consumed steel that might have built merchant ships to transport food and resources. She was torpedoed on her maiden voyage, taking with her those resources and 1,900 crew members. Every carrier Japan built represented trade-offs that became increasingly unsustainable as the war progressed. Building carriers required steel. Steel production required coal and iron ore. Transporting resources required merchant shipping. Protecting shipping required naval escorts. The system consumed itself in diminishing returns, while American industry expanded continuously. The broader strategic question haunted post-war analysis. Had anyone truly won? Japan suffered catastrophic defeat, its cities destroyed, its empire lost, its military and industrial capacity shattered. America achieved total victory, but at a cost measured in 400,000 dead servicemen, and a national debt that would take decades to repay. The carrier force that dominated the Pacific in 1945 became partially obsolete within years as jet aircraft and nuclear weapons redefined naval warfare. Those Essex-class carriers, built so rapidly and in such numbers, were decommissioned, recommissioned, modernized, and eventually scrapped, their service lives spanning the Cold War, but their design concepts belonging to a vanished era. Individual stories illustrated these complexities. The carrier Franklin survived catastrophic damage in March 1945 through extraordinary crew heroism. 807 of her crew died in fires and explosions that should have sunk the ship. The survivors saved Franklin through damage control efforts that represented the absolute peak of naval training and leadership. The ship reached Brooklyn Navy Yard, underwent repairs, and never deployed again before war's end. Was this victory? The ship survived, Japan lost, but 807 families received telegrams that wouldn't be unsent regardless of strategic outcomes. The kamikaze phenomenon represented Japanese desperation, but also tactical innovation. Suicide attacks achieved hit rates far exceeding conventional bombing, sinking dozens of ships and damaging hundreds more. American carriers, designed for rapid construction rather than survivability, proved vulnerable to these attacks. Only overwhelming numbers, more carriers than kamikazes could sink, allowed operations to continue. This suggested uncomfortable conclusions. Industrial capacity could offset tactical disadvantage, quantity could overcome quality, and victory belonged to whoever could sustain losses longer rather than whoever fought more skillfully. 2nd of September, 1945, on the deck of the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay, representatives of the Japanese government signed instruments of surrender, while dozens of American carriers anchored within sight, their aircraft flying overhead in formation. The war that began with 6 Japanese carriers attacking Pearl Harbor ended with 0 Japanese carriers operational and American carrier forces so large that operational commanders had difficulty coordinating them all. The asymmetry that decided the Pacific War would reshape naval thinking for generations. The carrier race between Japan and America represented more than shipbuilding statistics. It demonstrated that modern industrial warfare rewarded nations that could mobilize total productive capacity over extended periods. Japan's 6 elite carriers at war's start embodied one strategic philosophy: build the best possible weapons, train the best possible warriors, and defeat the enemy through superior quality. America's 17 fleet carriers built by war's end, with construction continuing beyond that, embodied the opposing philosophy. Build adequate weapons in overwhelming numbers, train adequate personnel continuously, and defeat the enemy through sheer material superiority. history rendered its verdict decisively. The human and industrial effort required for American victory deserved recognition without romanticism. Shipyard workers built carriers on 24-hour shifts while rationing sugar and gasoline. Women entered industrial trades previously closed to them, welding hull sections and installing complex machinery. Military personnel served tours that stretched months without relief. The home front mobilized to a degree modern America struggles to imagine. Victory required not just factories but a society willing to subordinate personal comfort to collective effort for years. Japanese perspectives added tragic dimension to the story. Sailors who served on Akagi at Pearl Harbor and survived to serve on later carriers watched their navy's fighting power erode despite their individual courage and skill. Pilots who'd trained for years in peace found themselves leading squadrons of barely trained replacements against overwhelming American forces. Shipyard workers built carriers knowing fuel shortages meant these ships might never sortie. The dedication was real, the sacrifice genuine, but dedication couldn't overcome industrial mathematics when one side could build 10 carriers for every one the other produced. The Essex-class carriers that dominated American strategy survived as museum ships, monuments to an era when industrial capacity decided wars. The USS Yorktown, commissioned in April 1943, now rests in Charleston, South Carolina, as a floating museum. Visitors walk the hangar deck where aircraft once staged for strikes against Japanese positions, see the ready rooms where pilots received briefings, and touch the catapults that launch thousands of combat missions. The ship represents both individual stories, specific sailors who served aboard, specific battles fought, and broader historical forces that made American victory inevitable once industrial production reached full capacity. Historians debate whether Japan could have won under any circumstances, whether different strategic choices might have produced different outcomes. These questions miss the fundamental asymmetry. Japan was a resource-poor island nation fighting a continental industrial power with 10 times its economic output. Building 6 carriers in 3 years represented an extraordinary achievement for Japan's industrial base. Building 17 in 3 years while simultaneously constructing dozens of other carrier types represented a fraction of American industrial capacity. The war was decided before it started in the factories, shipyards, and training facilities that would determine who could sustain losses longer. The title that America stopped counting captured something essential about the overwhelming nature of this production. Once the United States built more carriers than could realistically be engaged in the Pacific theater simultaneously, adding more became an exercise in excess capacity. This was victory through abundance, a peculiarly American approach to warfare that combined industrial might with operational flexibility. Japan had built a beautiful, capable, elite navy perfectly suited for a short war of decisive battles. America built a massive, adequate, overwhelming navy suited for grinding attrition across vast oceanic distances. The Pacific War proved which philosophy matched modern industrial warfare's realities.